Howdy folks, welcome back to Grumpy Viking Tactical. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, I'm going to do a bit of a video talking actually about the 1911 and kind of the dying days of the 1911, if you will, because honestly, when it comes to U.S. military service, I think when it comes to the Colt M45A1, we are seeing the last iteration of the 1911. What I have here is I have a TSOS Raider, which is a clone of the Colt 45 A1. And now there's differences even internally between this and the Colt. Let me take a moment and clear this, which actually it is already cleared, but just for the brevity of YouTube, so people aren't having a meltdown and thinking I'm handling a loaded gun. There you go, it is clear. But so the 1911, the 1911 design, it's a really old design. It dates all the way literally back to 1911. Actually, realistically, you can date its lineage back even further with some of Colt's earlier models. Like I think one of them was 1903, which was like a really early iteration, if you will, of a 1911. It would there'd be a couple models that would be produced before the 1911 in limited numbers. Some of them would only be prototypes, and then finally the 1911 would be produced. And actually what brought the 1911 around was actually a early pistol trial in, well, actually the pistol trial was in 1910 if I remember correctly, and the pistol trial would actually wrap up in 1911, which is why the 1911 got its name. And essentially there was a couple different pistols in the competition. If I remember correctly, one of them was like a Luger and 45 ACP. Of course, then you have the Colt 1911, which was also in 45 ACP. And then there's a couple revolvers as well in those pistol trials. And essentially the 1911 would actually take the cake and would be awarded the contract. So now a few changes would be made between the pistol that was submitted for the competition and the actual production models themselves. And then of course the pistol would actually remain as the main service pistol of the United States military for a long time. It would actually go through World War I, World War II, because obviously two world wars. Eat that Gluck. But you would also get Korea, you'd get Vietnam in there, and there was a lot of other different smaller wars, engagements, and etc., where the pistol had actually ended up being the primary service pistol. Now that being said, in the 1980s, I believe this was the early 1980s, there'd be a pistol competition. And essentially what brought the second pistol competition, or the 1980s pistol competition I'm talking about around, would be actually between World War I and World War II, they actually had produced so many 1911 pistols that they actually mothballed them. And that's actually what they were issuing. They were still issuing World War II pistols in Vietnam. And that's actually what the soldiers in Vietnam were using. They were using the old, literally leftover World War II pistols. Now, Special Forces, well, let's just, back that up a little bit. Essentially, the pistol would just continue its service on until then, and then you'd get the 1980s, the pistol competition, where, if I remember correctly, the pistols that were in it, I believe the 1911 was in the competition, because at the time they were still on the fence if they were going to keep the 1911 as the standard service pistol, which the 1911 kind of got quickly knocked off the pedestal of being the service pistol. There was another handgun design from Colt. I can't quite remember the name of that model Colt that was used. I don't even believe it went in production, but essentially it was a modernized, for the time, 1911 type design that would also feature a double stack magazine. It would actually feature a double stack 45 ACP magazine. That pistol, though, there were some issues with it which kind of knocked it out of the trial. And the other thing too, as things would roll through and the trial would continue on, it was decided that 45 ACP would not be the future service cartridge of the United States military. If I remember correctly, there was a Glock in the competition. It might have been like a really early, if I remember correctly, it was a really early Glock 17. So we're not even talking one of the good Glocks that people like to talk about. I mean, those early Glocks were not, honestly, not very good at all. You really don't even see that many of them around anymore, of the really early Generation 1 Glocks. Pardon me. There was a SIG, I believe it was a SIG P226 was in the competition. And then there was also the Beretta, well, it was actually the Beretta 92 FS. And essentially what it came down to for that competition, the two that were looked at the closest was actually the SIG Sauer P226 because of its double stack magazine, the way it performed, the price tag per unit, etc. And then you would also get the Beretta, and it was kind of the same thing, that both pistols performed fairly close together. If I remember correctly from the trials, there was a couple areas where the SIG outperformed the Beretta, but at the end of the day, the Beretta would actually take the cake of that competition because the Beretta was just the cheaper handgun between those two handguns. And then the Beretta would go on to be the standard service handgun of the United States military up until recent years, where it was replaced by the SIG M17. But it did replace the Beretta did knock the 1911 off its pedestal, and it did, you know, it would become the standard service pistol. However, with that being said, the 1911 would still continue as a standard service pistol for a short while. And actually, a YouTuber I had spoken with, H.R. Funk, who was in the United States Marine Corps, was even issued, when he enlisted in the Marine Corps as an MP, he was actually issued a 1911. And then even after he got out of the Marine Corps and was actually called back into service for Desert Storm, he was actually issued a 1911 again. Now we're talking, this is 1991. By this point, with the United States Army, most of the 1911s have been replaced by Beretta M9s, if not all of them. But in the Marine Corps, the 1911 would actually continue service for at least a little while longer as a standard service pistol. Now, with that being said, Special Forces units, particularly Delta Force comes to mind. Delta Force really liked the 1911 pistols, and essentially they were using, at that time, those World War II style 1911s within Delta Force. And actually, if you look at photographs of Mogadishu, and you can find information about the Delta Force equipment used during Mogadishu, I also believe Larry Vickers, which was another gentleman I was trying to set some things up with to try and do like a podcast interview with him, talking about the Delta Force equipment from like when he was in Delta Force. And if I remember correctly, he even discussed how the 1911 pattern pistol was actually his standard service pistol within Delta Force. Now, with that being said, over time, we're talking late 90s, early 2000s, just before the War on Terror, the 1911 pretty much was getting pushed out of service completely. And it was actually getting really hard at that point to find 1911s, and that's because a lot of Special Forces units at that point had started going to Glocks, they started going to SIGs, and then the standard military pistol, service pistol, was still the Beretta. But when the War on Terror came around, it was kind of like one of those of, we need pistols and we need them now. Different Special Forces communities actually had expanded. Some units that were not technically part of Special Forces actually got rolled into Special Forces, and suddenly they had access to different types of equipment that they didn't have access to before. One of said units that comes to mind, I believe, was actually the 75th Rangers. If you look, the 75th Rangers was not considered a Special Forces unit before the War on Terror, even though they kind of were a Special Forces unit because of what they specialize in. But so those Special Forces units, a lot of them would end up returning to 1911s. Some of the units were getting actually old World War II rebuilt Remington Rands, where they were disassembling the pistols, they were cleaning them up. These pistols were going back to like Colt. They were being disassembled, cleaned up, reworked, new parts put into them, and then they were sent back to the units, and then the units were kind of weeding out the good ones from the bad ones. And that's the pistols that they were using in the early years of the War on Terror. Alright folks, apologize for that, but had to change the battery quick. So anyway, they were essentially, just really quick recap just to make sure this was recorded. At that time, Special Forces, in the early years of the War on Terror, Special Forces was using rebuilt Remington Rands and other Colt 1911s, etc. And they were putting those into service. Now, with that being said, as time would go on, orders were being put out for brand new 1911s, 4 different Special Forces units. A Para Ordnance, I believe, was one of the 1911s that was being purchased. I believe they were purchased for the 75th Rangers. There were some Springfields that were purchased as well, and they were more modern 1911s like this one. They may not have had all the features like this one had. Like, if I remember correctly, with the Para Ordnance, it did not have an accessory rail. It had Novak sights, but it wasn't night sights, if I remember correctly. So on and so forth. Things of that nature. Now, MARSOC would actually put in an order for pistols as well. And, well, actually, technically the Marine Corps, because they were put in place for MARSOC. And essentially, in the very early years of MARSOC, and this is why I'm focusing now on MARSOC, is the very early years, they were also issued rebuilt 1911 pistols. And then they would put out orders for new pistols, which, if I recall correctly, understand I may be a little bit wrong on the information here, but if I recall correctly, they were getting actually Kimbers. They were getting modern Kimber 1911s. They didn't get many of them. They only got a handful. But then they would finalize on what should the MARSOC 1911 look like. And essentially it would come out to something very similar to this gun here. And it would become the Colt M45A. Well, sorry, that'd be the Colt M45 and the Colt M45A1, which, going by its service, and unfortunately this is where I feel the 1911's service history gets a bit tarnished, is those early Colt M45s, there was something wrong with the coating, and the coating was faulty, and there was issues with the coating, essentially peeling, chipping, grinding off, whatever. And it would get in the internals and it would just gum the works up so bad where you couldn't pull the trigger, you couldn't engage the safety, the hammer, stuff of that nature. And that's actually what was going on with those really early 1911s. And if you do see, the way to tell from an early Colt M45A1 and a late model Colt M45A1 is the early models, they have a coating very similar to this, but it's more of a lighter sand color. Where this is FDE, that I believe is it might be Coyote Tan, I think is what the color is, but it's a lighter, more sandy like color. And then the later models, so because of the coating, Colt decided to go to a completely different coating method and what kind of coating they were using, and the new coating looks more like peanut butter, for lack of a better term. Kind of has like this orange brownish color to this. It's even different looking than this is. Now this is a TSOS Raider, so this is just a clone of the M45, and it is a really great example of a more modern 1911. I really enjoy this gun. But that being said, looking through the eyes of nostalgia, I own multiple 1911s myself. And I was in the service, and I had a Beretta when I was in the service, And what I have to say is I kind of understand why we're seeing the 1911s die. They're a really old design handgun. Do they still work? Yes. But as a service pistol, I just don't feel the 1911 is really a viable pistol option anymore. Not when you got guns like Glocks. God, I hate Glocks, and I hate to say that, but because of guns like Glocks, because of the SIG M17 in particular, the Beretta M9, this thing, you kind of look on this thing and go, yeah, this thing's long on the tooth. And while this is great for me, for say home defense, target shooting, hunting, etc., this probably really isn't something you should be carrying on the modern battlefield as a service pistol, just in my opinion. And for those who believes that the Beretta should not have replaced the 1911, well, I can argue with you on absolutely why the Beretta should have replaced the 1911. And that is coming from someone who is an absolute lover of 1911s. I own multiple 1911s myself. So I do believe, short of like some kind of world war or major war that comes up all of a sudden, I believe we are seeing the dying days of the 1911 pattern in United States military service. It has had a hell of a long run, though. It's been over 100 years, and it is still used. Actually, the M41 or the M45A1, I believe, is the last 1911 pattern handgun still in service with the United States military. It's only in service with MARSOC. And it's actually only in service with a handful of MARSOC units because a lot of the units are starting to switch over to Glocks as well. They actually have been since I want to say 2016 is when they started switching over to Glocks. And before you Glock fanboys get all excited and say it's because Glocks are better than 1911s. No, actually the Marine Corps actually released a statement, or the command structure, the top brass, if you will, of MARSOC actually did release a statement saying the only reason they're going on the Glocks is because of the double stack magazines, the price tag per unit, and 9mm ammunition. It comes down to they're switching to Glocks because of logistics, not because it's a superior pistol to the 1911. And don't get me wrong, I will argue there are some things that are better on the Glock, just, you know, past the fact that I despise Glocks, that is even better than a 1911. But I'm going to tip my hat off to John Moses Browning. He made a hell of a pistol. It's still a hell of a pistol. I just don't think it's a good service pistol anymore, to be honest. Anyway, folks, going to wrap the video up at that. Pardon me. But really quick, I want to give a shout out to the Patreons. Their additional support does help out my channel when it comes to a channel budget. With that being said, anyone who watches the videos, likes the videos, subscribes the whole 9 yards, I really appreciate that as well. It still helps me out as a YouTuber. But anyway, folks, I'm actually going to wrap up today's video at that. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.